12 humans walked on the moon. The last one, Eugene Cernan, climbed back into the lunar module on December 14, 1972, brushed the dust off his boots and said, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return." We never returned. Not in 1980. Not in 1995. Not in 2010. And as of 2026, 53 years later, not once. The most technologically aggressive civilization in recorded history, a species that has launched probes beyond our solar system, built a space station the size of a football field, and can sequence a genome in 48 hours, has not sent a single human being back to a rock that sits just 3 days away. That silence is not an accident. And in 2026, for the first time, the data tells us exactly why. The official story has always been clean, logical, and when you really sit with it, deeply unsatisfying. NASA ended Apollo because Congress cut the budget. The Vietnam War was bleeding the country dry. Public interest faded after Apollo 11. Once you have seen a man walk on the moon, the second and third time feels like a repeat. Richard Nixon wanted the money redirected. The program was expensive, dangerous, and politically complicated, so they stopped. That story is true. Partially. Budget records confirm it. The Apollo program cost roughly $25 billion between 1960 and 1972, equivalent to about $280 billion in today's money. After Apollo 17, NASA's budget was slashed from 4.4% of the federal budget to under 1%. The political will evaporated. But here is what that explanation does not answer. Why, in 50 years of recovered funding, renewed public enthusiasm, and 2 dedicated return programs, including the current Artemis mission, have we still not actually gone back? Why does every timeline slip? Why does every launch window move? Why, when we now have technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the Apollo engineers, do we keep finding reasons to wait? The budget story explains 1972. It does not explain 2026. What the Apollo crews brought back, and this part gets buried under the flag-planting photographs and the grainy television footage, was data so unexpected that it quietly rewrote NASA's internal risk calculations for the next half-century. Start with the radiation. Space has always been radioactive, that's known. But what the Apollo missions measured in transit and on the lunar surface was different in character from what pre-mission models predicted. The moon has no magnetosphere, no invisible shield like Earth's that deflects charged particles from the sun and deep space. It has no atmosphere to absorb them. What this means in practice is that the lunar surface is bathed constantly and without interruption in 2 distinct forms of radiation: solar energetic particles from the sun and galactic cosmic rays arriving from outside the solar system. The Apollo astronauts were on the surface for hours at a time. The longest any crew spent outside was Apollo 17, about 22 hours across 3 moonwalks. Their dosimeters recorded doses that were, by post-mission analysis, close to the upper limits NASA considered acceptable for a career's worth of exposure. Not over the limit. Close to it. In 3 days. Now think about what a sustained return mission looks like. Artemis isn't planning a 3-day visit. The goal, as stated publicly by NASA, is a sustained presence. Weeks, eventually months. A lunar gateway station. Possibly a permanent surface habitat. Run the Apollo radiation numbers forward to a 30-day stay, and you are no longer talking about acceptable career doses. You are talking about doses that, according to a 2021 analysis published in the journal Space Weather by researchers at the Christian Albrechts Universität in Kiel, Germany, would exceed NASA's own lifetime exposure limits in a single mission. The math is not close. It is not a rounding error. A 30-day unshielded lunar surface stay delivers roughly the equivalent of a full-body CT scan every single day. That data existed in rough form since the early 1970s. What changed in 2026 was the precision. In January of this year, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has been circling the moon since 2009 and quietly building the most detailed map of the lunar surface ever assembled, released a radiation environment dataset that researchers outside the agency immediately flagged as significant. The dataset combined 17 years of continuous measurement, with new modeling techniques developed partly from machine learning analysis of solar weather patterns going back to 1950. What it showed was not just the average radiation environment on the moon, it showed the variance. This is the part that changes everything. Stop for a second and think about what variance means here. The difference between an average radiation day on the lunar surface and a peak event day is not 10%. It is not 50%. During a significant solar particle event, the kind that happens several times during an 11-year solar cycle, surface radiation levels can spike by a factor of several hundred within hours. The 2003 Halloween solar storms would have delivered a potentially lethal dose in under 10 hours if astronauts had been on the surface. The 2026 dataset maps exactly how often events of that magnitude occur, where on the surface they are worst, and critically, how little warning time the current detection systems would provide. The answer on warning time is somewhere between 15 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the event type. You cannot build a radiation shelter in 15 minutes. You cannot get from the lunar surface to a shielded orbital vehicle in 2 hours if you are on a moonwalk several kilometers from your lander. This is not a conspiracy. This is orbital mechanics and solar physics. The 2026 data did not reveal a secret. It quantified a known danger to a degree that makes the engineering problem undeniable. But radiation is only the first wall. There are two more, and together they form the real picture of why we stopped and why returning is genuinely hard. The second wall is dust. Lunar regolith, the fine powder that covers the entire surface of the moon, is nothing like dust on Earth. On Earth, dust particles get tumbled and softened over time by wind, water, and friction. Lunar dust has never experienced any of that. It has been shattered by micrometeorite impacts for billions of years in a vacuum, producing particles with sharp, jagged edges at the microscopic level. Under a scanning electron microscope, lunar dust looks less like powder and more like broken glass. The Apollo astronauts discovered within hours that this dust got into everything. It clogged joints in spacesuits, it scratched visors, it contaminated equipment seals. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on Apollo 17, developed what he described as lunar hay fever within hours of returning to the lunar module after the first moonwalk. They experienced congestion, sneezing, and an irritated throat caused by dust that had infiltrated the cabin despite their best efforts. For a 3-day mission, that was manageable. For a 30-day mission, researchers at the NASA Glenn Research Center have estimated that dust accumulation on solar panels alone would reduce power output by up to 40% within the first 2 weeks without active cleaning systems. Dust infiltration into life support components, such as seals, filters, and ventilation, introduces failure risks that scale with time in ways that short missions simply do not encounter. Nobody solved the dust problem after Apollo. It is still unsolved. The 2026 LRO dataset includes new granulometric mapping of surface dust distribution that shows some regions are significantly worse than others, and that the areas with the most scientifically interesting geology tend to correlate with the highest dust concentrations. The third wall is the one nobody in official NASA communications spends much time on, but researchers who study long-duration spaceflight will tell you, carefully, it is perhaps the most fundamental. Human physiology in low gravity degrades. Mars has about 38% of Earth's gravity. The Moon has about 16% of Earth's gravity. The International Space Station has essentially zero gravity. We have extensive data from the International Space Station on what happens to the human body in microgravity over 6 months, including bone density loss, muscle atrophy, fluid shifts that increase intracranial pressure, and vision impairment from changes in the shape of the eye. Some of these effects reverse on return to Earth. Some do not fully reverse. Some, particularly the vision changes, are still not well understood. The Moon is not microgravity. It is low gravity, which means the data from the International Space Station does not directly transfer. We genuinely do not know what 6 months at 16% of Earth's gravity does to the human body, because we have never measured it. The longest any human has spent on the lunar surface is 75 hours. 75 hours of human data on the Moon. That is the entire physiological data set for the environment NASA is planning to put people in for months. And underneath all of the science sits the part that budget records make brutally clear, even when press releases don't. Apollo was not primarily a science program. It was a geopolitical signal. John F. Kennedy said as much in 1961. The goal was to land on the moon before the Soviet Union, full stop. The science was real, the engineering achievement was genuine, but the urgency was political. Once the race was won, the urgency collapsed. The rockets were already built. The engineers were already hired. So they flew a few more missions, collected more rocks, and then stopped because the original reason for going was gone. Every major moon return program since has faced a version of the same problem. The 1989 Space Exploration Initiative under George H.W. Bush was projected to cost $500 billion and died in committee. The 2004 Vision for Space Exploration under George W. Bush was canceled by the Obama administration before a single crewed test flight. Constellation, Ares, Orion in its original form were all restructured, delayed, or cut. Artemis is the most serious attempt yet. The Space Launch System is real hardware. Artemis 1 flew in 2022. Artemis 2, the first crewed lunar flyby, has been on the manifest for years. But even Artemis has slipped repeatedly, not because of political will this time, but because the engineering problems made explicit by the 2026 data are not solved. The radiation shelter designs are not finalized. The dust mitigation systems are in prototype. The long-duration physiological data simply does not exist yet. Some researchers in the field, speaking carefully because this is not a popular thing to say, have begun arguing that the honest interpretation of the accumulated evidence is that we stopped going to the moon because the moon, for humans, is genuinely and surprisingly hostile. It is not impossible to visit. It was visited 12 times. But it is not a place where sustained human presence is simple, safe, or cheap. And every time an administration looks hard at the real numbers, the radiation variance, the dust failure rates, and the unknown physiology, the timeline moves right. That is not a cover-up. Cover-ups are simpler. This is harder. It is a problem we have not solved, pretending to be a problem we are about to solve. Here is why this matters right now, in 2026, beyond the history. The Artemis program's stated goal is a permanent lunar presence as a stepping stone to Mars. Mars is a 6 to 9 month transit each way. Mars has its own radiation environment, its own dust, and its own low-gravity physiology questions, all of them harder than the moon's because the distances eliminate emergency return. If we cannot solve the lunar problem for a 30-day stay 3 light seconds from Earth, the Mars timeline is not just ambitious. It is, by the logic of the 2026 data, premature. The LRO dataset released in 2026 is being used by engineers at multiple institutions precisely because it forces the conversation. You cannot look at 17 years of radiation variance data and say the problem is minor. You cannot map the granular dust distribution across candidate landing sites and say dust mitigation is a secondary concern. The data does not allow comfortable vagueness anymore. What the 2026 numbers actually do, and this is what the researchers who spent months analyzing them keep coming back to, is clarify the order of operations. First, radiation shielding that works for months, not hours. Second, dust containment at the material and mechanical level. Third, genuine low-gravity physiology data probably gathered on the lunar surface itself before committing to longer stays. In that order. Not simultaneously. Not on the current Artemis schedule as publicly stated. Eugene Cernan said we would return as we came. He was not wrong to believe it. Nobody was wrong to believe it. The moon is close, the achievement was real, and the instinct that we would be back within a decade was completely reasonable in 1972. What we did not know then, what 50 years of data collection, 17 years of orbital measurement, and one detailed 2026 dataset have finally forced into the open, is that the moon is not waiting patiently for us. It is radiating, abrasive, physiologically unmapped, and exactly as indifferent to our timelines as it has always been. We stopped going because going is hard in ways that a flag and a footprint do not show. The next crew that lands there will need more than courage. They will need the answers to problems that, as of right now, we are still working out. That is not a reason to stop trying. But it is finally an honest reason for why it took this long.